And turn to John chapter 11. Someone mentioned this morning it's been a few weeks since we have been in the Gospel of John for our regular Sunday morning series. It has been. We had Mother's Day and graduate recognition and some other things. And so we're back in John and we're in chapter 11. And I want to cover initially what seems to be a big chunk of verses. I'm going to read through verse 46, and you think we're going to be here all day, but we're really not. And so trust me on this. We're going to read one story, one narrative that I'm going to pull some truth from. But if you don't get the whole story, you might miss out on something. And so that's why I'm reading this morning this whole section of verses from John chapter 11. And the title of the message is, "When Does Dead Not Mean Dead?" When does dead not mean dead? John 11, beginning in verse 1. "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, to Jesus, saying, 'Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick.' But when Jesus heard this, he said, 'This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him.' This he said, and after that he said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep.' The disciples then said to him, 'Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover.' In other words, he'll be okay. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead. And I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.' Therefore Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, so that we may die with him.' So when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus, had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. Many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet them, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you.' Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha said to him, 'I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.' Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?' She said to him, 'Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world.' When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, 'The teacher is here and is calling for you.' And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.' When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, 'Where have you laid him?' They said to him, 'Lord, come and see.' Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, 'Come See how he loved him. Some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying? So Jesus again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, remove the stone. Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what Jesus had done believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. There's a lot in this chapter, right? A lot packed in to these verses. We see here about the compassion that God has for us when we are in our pain, that He cares about us when we suffer here on earth. We see about death and resurrection. We see that Jesus claimed to be the resurrection and the life. There's a lot going on here, and we could spend a lot of time, many weeks, here in this section, but I've decided to take the long view or take the telescope view and back out and pull out some truths from these verses instead of getting lost in what I call the tall grass. I want to take the big picture. You know, at the heart of this story is the sickness and the eventual death of a very close friend of Jesus. His name was Lazarus. You've probably heard that name before you heard it just now. It's about the story of a home that Jesus visited, apparently on a frequent basis. It was close to Jerusalem, and Lazarus had these two sisters named Mary and Martha, and Jesus went there, and they were his friends, and so they were able to do the things that friends do. They encouraged each other, and they loved each other, and Jesus spent time there with those siblings. But then death came to that home and to those people that Jesus loved. And that sets the table for these important truths that I want to see from this story today. You know, when we talk about these narratives, watch this, there's always the story, what happened, the historical account, and then there are the truths that we take away from that, right? And both are important. The story is important, and we study that, and the truths that we take from the story are important, and we study those. You've got what happened, and you've got what we can learn from what happened. And so what happened here is pretty straightforward, if not miraculous. Lazarus, a friend of Jesus, got sick. Mary and Martha, thinking they had a little bit of time, sent word to Jesus, hey, your friend, the one that you love, is sick, and maybe if you'll come, you can heal him and everything will be okay. But Jesus did not leave immediately, as you know. But he stayed around Jerusalem for a little bit longer, and by the time Jesus got to Bethany, Lazarus had already died and was in fact had been in the grave for 4 days by that point. But that was not the end of the story, of course, because Jesus went to the grave and he called Lazarus forth by name, and here comes Lazarus out of the grave, still wrapped in the grave clothes, and Jesus said, take all that off of him and let him go. So that's the narrative. That's a historical account. That's the story. But here I want to show you some things that we can pull out of this and apply it to our lives. For instance, here's the first one. If you're taking notes, this is number one. God's glory is more important than our will. God's glory is more important than our will. This is one of those foundational truths that we need to learn as the body, as Christians. And watch this, church. When we learn this, as hard as it is, it will change the way we experience life and look at what's going on in life. once we figure out that the most important thing in this life is for God to be glorified and not for me to have what I want and the way that I want it, it will change the way we live as Christians. Think about that. That's a life-changing, foundational truth. What is this life about? Is it about me as a Christian getting everything I want just the way that I want it and having all of my physical needs met the way that I want them to be met, when I want them to be met? Or is life about something bigger than that, perhaps the glory of God? And so what Jesus does here in this story, this narrative, is teach us that this life is not simply about us getting what we want here and now. It's about the Father and the Son being glorified through our lives. Now pay close attention to this. We tend, even as Christians, to be, watch this, me-centric and now-oriented. Did you hear that? Me-centric and now-oriented. What does that mean? I believe life is about me, and I want what I want when I want it. I'm all about what I want, and I'm about the now. I'm about the present. What does that sound like, by the way, off the top of my head? That sounds like a toddler, doesn't it, right? A toddler is the epitome of being me-centric and now-oriented. And we think like a toddler sometimes as Christians. The world is all about me. This life as a Christian is all about what I want. And what I do want, I want it now. It's all about the here and now, not the eternal. And the Christian life is not just about me, and it's just not just about the here and now. And if we're thinking wrong, that'll color everything that happens to us, especially the painful things, right? Watch this. I haven't done a very good job of teaching this so far this morning. Kind of stumbled around. I'll be okay. If I face the painful things of life, right, which we all face, amen? They all come to us. If I face those things and I evaluate those things based on a me-centric, now-oriented perspective, that's going to be a tough way to live because I'm always thinking about myself. But if I face the painful things in life thinking this, how can God be glorified through this pain in my life, then that changes our outlook, doesn't it? Right? It changes the way we see things. Takes our eyes off of ourselves and the present day situation that we find ourselves in, and it puts our eyes on something bigger than that. And that's what Jesus did. The messenger came to Jesus with a real life problem that we all face. Lazarus is sick. Somebody loved him. 2 sisters and all of these friends, and even Jesus. We all face these kind of situations, right? Somebody in our family is sick. We have a death in the family. We have a situation in our family that's painful, and then we struggle and we suffer through. And this word came to Jesus, and one of the things he meant to teach in this is, how will this thing that has happened bring glory to the Father? How will God use this painful thing in my life to magnify Himself? Look at verse 4 again. When Jesus heard about Lazarus, He said, this sickness is not to end in death. In other words, the purpose of this sickness, the end result of this is not about Lazarus, and it's not about the physical, but the purpose is the glory of God. And so that I, He said, will be glorified in this. And so, if you ask Jesus, why did Lazarus get sick? His answer would be, it's part of God's plan to bring glory to Himself and to me. That's what Jesus said. Why did Lazarus get sick? Well, God didn't let Lazarus get sick in order to bring about his death. He let Lazarus get sick in order to bring about my glory. That's what Jesus is teaching us here. Why did Jesus go to Bethany in time to heal Lazarus before he died? Because God's plan was to bring glory to Himself by letting him die and then letting him be raised again. You see how evaluating this circumstance Whether it's good or not good or evil depends on what our perspective is. Is it all about me or is it about the glory of God? Mary and Martha were not thinking in terms of God's glory, and neither would we, right? Mary and Martha were not sitting around at home thinking, isn't this a wonderful thing that Lazarus has got sick? Maybe God can glorify himself in that. That is not the way they were thinking, and it's not the way you and I think. That's not normal, right? That's not natural. They wanted him to be healed. That was what they naturally wanted. And we would have felt the same way. But Jesus pulled back the curtain of sovereignty and said, it's not about Lazarus. It's not about Mary and Martha. It's not about this physical illness. This is about the glory of God. Now that sounds all good in theory, doesn't it? Can we be real just a little bit? That sounds good in theory, especially when we're talking about somebody else. But what about when it's us that's going through those hard, painful times? Times of suffering and heartache. What about when it's us? Not somebody else you're reading about or hearing about. Or what about if it's your family, if it's your children or your grandchildren? That's a whole different story, isn't it? You see, theory is always easier than practice. It's always easier to hear about people like Lazarus and Mary and Martha and Job and the man who was born blind back in John chapter 9 that we talked about. It's easy to read about those people and think, boy, God used their pain and suffering for His glory. Isn't that great? What if that story's about us? Are y'all picking up what I'm laying down here? That changes everything, doesn't it? It's easy in theory. It's not so easy in practice. What if God chooses to bring some painful situation into our life for the purpose of glorifying Himself in order to point others to Jesus? That's a different story altogether. I want to tell you, it takes great faith. Are you hearing me, church? It takes great faith to stand in the face of a painful situation or a great loss and say, how can God glorify Himself in this? That takes great faith. Can God show something tremendous about Himself through our suffering? That's what He's doing with the situation of Lazarus. Jesus said, look, when this is all said and done, hey, we're not finished yet, but when this is all said and done, God is going to be glorified more than you can ever imagine. Do you ever think about situations in your life like that? Man, you're in the midst of something painful. Can you for just a moment say, I don't know what's going to happen, and I am suffering terribly, but I trust that when this is all said and done, God is going to be glorified like never before. That's a tough situation. Watch me. We want God to be glorified in our victories, don't we? We want God to be glorified in our victories, but we don't dare to think that God wants to be glorified also in our pain and in our suffering. We want to be the one that something miraculous happens to on the front end before we suffer this great loss. And, oh, God can get glory that way. Yes, He can, but sometimes He chooses to let us suffer great pain and heartache to bring glory to Himself. Jesus teaches us that God's glory is always more important than our will. Painful lesson. Painful lesson, right? Here's the second thing I want you to see. And it's this: God desires our spiritual growth more than our physical comfort. God desires our spiritual growth more than our physical comfort. We have a hard time accepting God's values sometimes and what He puts a priority on. For instance, God values the spiritual over the physical. And He values the eternal over the temporal. And He values our growth as Christians over our comfort as Christians. Think about that. Look at it. Look at the words. God desires you to grow spiritually more than He desires you to be physically comfortable. Now, will God comfort you in your pain and your physical ailments? Of course He will. but is that His ultimate priority for us is to just be physically well? No. His ultimate priority is that we grow spiritually. Now, could God engineer the circumstances of our life so that we're always happy and we're always healthy and we're always wealthy? Could God, in His power and sovereignty, engineer the circumstances of our life so that that is always a reality? Yes, He could. But no, He never would. He never would. Why? Because our spiritual growth doesn't happen best in an atmosphere where we're always happy and we're always healthy and we always have all the physical things of life that we desire. Spiritual growth does not take place in that environment. Physical growth takes place in an environment where we sometimes suffer and we sometimes have heartaches and we struggle and we get to the bottom where all we have to do is look to the Lord. Could God do those things? Of course He could. But He never would. Because His ultimate goal for us is not for us just to be comfortable here on this earth, but for us to grow spiritually to our utmost potential. That's what He wants. That's what He wants. If He were to withhold the painful things that we go through, what would that mean for us? It would obviously mean that we're not growing like we could otherwise. God's goal is our growth and maturity. You know, there's a lot of false teaching around today that's centered on this idea that God really doesn't want us to suffer, that that's our lack of faith and therefore our fault, and that God really wants us to be healthy, wealthy, and happy all the time. Do you know that that's false teaching? Do you understand that, church? Please understand that. Don't listen to those teachers who say that if you're not happy all the time and healthy all the time and wealthy all the time, that it's somehow your fault, that you just don't have enough faith, that God wants you to have all those things. That is not true. That is not true. God allows us to suffer and to go through painful circumstances. Why? Because that's the greatest incubator for our spiritual growth. And that's what He wants for us. And so we see that truth here. Jesus got word Lazarus is sick. Instead of leaving to go immediately, what happened? Look in verse 6. So He heard that he was sick. He stayed 2 days longer in the place that he was. What in the world is going on? Why in the world would Jesus stay 2 days longer where he was instead of immediately going to Lazarus' side where he could heal him? Why would He do that? Look at verse 5. You'll see the reason. Because Jesus loved them. Now that doesn't compute for a lot of us, that Jesus stayed around longer, allowing Lazarus to die, and the fact that He loved them. Why did He stay? Because He loved them. Why, if He loved them, didn't He go and heal them? Because He wanted them to what? To grow spiritually. To grow spiritually. In our way of thinking, and in the world's way of wanting us to think, if Jesus had really loved them, He would have left immediately where He could have alleviated some of their pain. But had He done that, by the way, Jesus didn't have to go there to heal him. He could have done it where he was, right? But He didn't. Why? Because He wanted them to go through circumstances that would create spiritual growth for them. The juxtaposition, the fact that Jesus loved them and yet He let them suffer, it's hard for some people to understand, but not when you understand that His ultimate goal is not our physical comfort, but our spiritual growth. Then it makes perfect sense. Doesn't make it any easier, but it makes perfect sense. Jesus cared more about their faith than He did their health or their mental well-being. Jesus loves us so much. Do you know this, church? He loves us so much that He will sometimes create an environment for you that causes you to grow, but it will not be very comfortable. It will be painful. Why? Because He values your growth over your comfort. Look at what He said to His disciples as an explanation for this delay. Look in verse 14 and 15. Jesus said to them, Lazarus is dead. How do you know that? He's 2 miles away, right? He did not get a text message. He wasn't looking on social media. How did he know that he was already dead while he was still yet there? Well, we know why, because he was God. But look at verse 15. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there. Jesus, he just laid it all out there. Boys, I am glad I didn't go where I could heal him and keep him from dying. And I didn't do that because it was for you. Look at the rest of that verse, 15. So that you may believe. In other words, what is he saying? I want your faith to grow through this. I could have gone. By the way, if he'd have gone and healed Lazarus in time before he died, would their faith grown some? Yeah, probably a little bit. But remember, they'd already seen Jesus heal a lot of people, right? Been there, done that. Would their faith grown a little? Would Mary Martha's faith grown a little bit? And Lazarus, had Jesus gotten there and maybe laid his hand on Lazarus and healed him or spoke? And yeah, it would have grown some. But how much more did it grow by the fact that by the time Jesus got there, Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days already. And there was no doubt that Lazarus was stone dead. Right? The fact is Jesus loved them. The fact is he let Lazarus die when he could have prevented it. Why? Because he wanted them to grow spiritually. That's what he said. That's what he said. Jesus knew what he was doing when he delayed going. Not because he was uncaring, not because he was unkind, not because he didn't love them. That's expressly clear. It's because he wanted them to grow. Got there, Martha said, well, if you'd just been here, if you'd just gotten here a little earlier, what? What if I'd have just gotten here early? Your physical needs would have been met, but where would you have been spiritually? Mary goes out. Well, Lord, if you'd have just been here a little bit sooner, what? What, Mary? If I'd have been here sooner, what? Would you have grown more in that or what I'm about to do? Right? That's what he had in his mind. That's what he had in his heart. Jesus' first priority is our spiritual growth. What would he say to us today? He would say the same thing that he said about the 3 siblings. I love you so much that I will sometimes allow you to go through things that cause you to grow. I'm not uncaring. I'm not unkind. The ultimate love, the ultimate demonstration of Jesus' love is unquestionable, right? He loved us, and we know that because he did what? He laid down his life for us on the cross. But he also wants us to grow spiritually. He also wants us to grow. It's not because he doesn't love us that we suffer. It's because he does love us that we suffer sometimes. All right, here's the third one. I'm moving on. Fast. Are y'all listening fast? Number 3. We see this. Very simply, death is no match for God. Death is no match for God. That's the climax of the whole chapter, right? Whole chapter, when you pull away from this, is that Lazarus was resurrected from the dead after he'd been in the grave for 4 days. You know the story. You know the story how Jesus went out to the graveside and all the people followed him out there like, what is he going to do? We better go out here. We don't want to miss anything. And how Jesus called Lazarus by name. And of course, everybody through the ages have said that if Jesus didn't call by name Lazarus, that all the dead people in that cemetery would have been raised. We don't know that. But he said, Lazarus, come on out. And Lazarus came out, and they took off the grave clothes. And up until this point, listen, church, up until this point in Jesus' ministry, this was the greatest miracle Jesus had performed, right? The greatest miracle that he had done. Greater than healing blind people and lame people, as great as that is, greater than walking on water, greater than turning water into wine. As a matter of fact, there's only going to be one miracle greater than this. You know what that is, right? After his own resurrection. So up until this point, with only one more greater, it's the greatest thing Jesus had done. And Jesus is just stacking evidence, right? He's trying to convince these people, right? Because that's what this gospel is all about. People believing in Jesus. He's just stacking evidence. Here's one more thing Jesus said that you've got to, watch me, that you've got to crawl over in your unbelief. Here's one more thing, Jews, that you've got to crawl over if you're going to avoid me being the Messiah. He's stacking evidence. He did something that only God can do. He raised a dead man. And he left no doubt that he was the Messiah, sent from God. He left no doubt that he was God of very God. With all of this, no man, watch me, no man can say I need just a little more proof. No man can say, I just need a little more evidence, and then maybe, Jesus, I'll believe. No. When we discover that death is no match for Jesus, that should settle it, right? He also shows us in this idea about death is that not only did he defeat death, but he redefined it. Go back up in verses 11 and 13. I'm not going to read them because I'm running behind. Go back up 11 and 13. How did Jesus redefine death? He said to the disciples, now, here's the deal. We're talking about Lazarus being dead, but the fact is he's not dead, he's just asleep. I said, what? In fact, they said, they didn't understand it, right? They said, well, if he's just asleep, what's the big deal? Why are we even worried about going or not? Why are we going to walk 2 miles and risk our life where the Jews don't like you? Why are we going to do that if he's just asleep? Jesus said, he's dead in your eyes, but in my eyes, he's just asleep. Was he physically dead? Watch me. Was he physically dead? He'd been dead for 4 days. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Jesus said in redefining death, death for a Christian is no longer final. I redefined it, and it's no longer final. It's just like going to sleep. Just like going to sleep. Do we as Christians think about death differently than people in the world do? Absolutely. Because death for those people that don't know Jesus is final. Life ends at the grave. For the Christian, life goes through the grave, right? It's not final. It's just like sleep. By the way, do you know where the word cemetery comes from? We talk about the cemetery being a place of the dead, right? A place where we park dead people. The word in the original cemetery meant it referred to a sleeping place. A sleeping place. And Christians took that word and they brought it over into the faith and said, wouldn't it be a great idea if we referred to this place where we park dead people, bodies, as just being a sleeping place? Because that's the way Jesus redefined death. It's just sleep. It's not final. Some of you are going to go home this afternoon. Some of you have already started, by the way, and you're going to take a nap. By the way, I walked into the office a couple of Sundays ago, and a couple of our main upstanding men were looking at the desk, and they were looking at a sleep machine. One of those things, you put on like this. And I'm looking at that, and I'm about to preach in a little bit, right? And I'm thinking, man, y'all are really planning on sleeping good, right? You're going to go home this afternoon, you get that for free. You're going to go home this afternoon, some of you are going to lay down and take a nap, right? You can hardly wait, right? You're going to get through lunch as fast as you can, you're going to take a nap. I doubt anybody walks by you taking a nap and think, well, I'm sure going to miss him. He's gone forever. No, they're going to know you're going to wake up unless something catastrophic happens. Why? Because sleep is not final. Sleep is just this thing that doesn't last very long. And for a follower of Jesus, that's death. Because Jesus not only defeated death, he redefined death. Do we grieve when somebody we love dies? Sure we do. But we don't grieve as the world who has no hope. One more thing, we'll be done. Number 4, Jesus teaches us here that a hardened heart is rarely changed even by the miraculous. A hardened heart is rarely changed even by the miraculous. You know the most shocking thing, and I'm not trying to sound super spiritual here, the most shocking thing in this story is not that Jesus raised a dead man. That really doesn't shock me, and it doesn't shock you. What's shocking here is how some people responded to that. How some people reacted to that. I'm not surprised at all that Jesus raised a dead man. Jesus made everything there is out of nothing that was. Anything after that is a piece of cake. I'm not surprised that he raised a dead man. I'm surprised that everybody didn't believe in him at that point. The Bible says, if you see in verse 45, many of the Jewish people did come to faith in Jesus. They were out there, they saw. They knew Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. They could get a little whiff of him when the wind was right. And when he walked out of that grave, guess what those people did? They believed in Jesus. They believed in Jesus. But then what does verse 46 say? But many of them didn't. And they ran off to the Pharisees to report Jesus and what he had done. How could those people see the same thing that the people in verse 45 saw? And the people in verse 45 believed in Jesus, and the people in verse 46 ran off to help plan the death of Jesus. Because those in 46 had a hardened heart. They had a hardened heart. The people in verse 45 wanted to believe. They were willing to believe. They said in their heart, if I just have a little bit of evidence, I am going to believe in Jesus. Boom, they got it and they believed. They wanted to believe. People in verse 46 didn't want to believe. And a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more evidence, even the miraculous, like raising the dead, is not enough and will never be enough, because a hardened heart will never, ever believe unless God changes it. Hardened heart. See, you have people who cannot believe, and you have people who will not believe. And if you're in a situation today, you're here in the building, you're watching us, and you just will not believe because of a stubborn, rebellious, hardened heart, I'm saying, be warned. Be warned. Because God will not always call you to Himself. A hardened heart is rebellious against God. Don't be that person. Maybe today you're going through a tough time. God's trying to use that to bring glory to Himself. That's hard. That's hard. Keep your eyes focused on Him. Keep the big picture. Somehow, I know it's hard, somehow see things in the big view of life. Maybe in your situation where God's growing you by taking you through tough times, allowing you to experience some of these things that I've mentioned. God's trying to grow you. Be thankful that He loves you enough, as hard as that is. Be thankful that He loves you enough that He'll allow you to suffer in order to grow. Maybe you're here, or maybe you're watching and you've got a rebellious heart against God. Be warned. Be warned. You won't always have an opportunity to believe. And watch me, every time you say no, your heart gets a little harder, a little harder, a little harder. I want you to stand with your heads bowed. Your eyes closed this morning. Music is going to play. Perhaps God has called you to make some kind of decision publicly for Him today. Maybe He's been dealing with your heart for weeks or months, and you need to make a decision for Him today because you're not promised tomorrow. Or maybe this morning you'd come and say, Pastor, I'm going through that hard time. God's trying to grow me. I trust Him, but it sure is hard. Pastor, would you pray with me that I'd be strengthened and helped? Yeah, I would. I would. Let's wait just a moment to see what God asks you to do. Say yes to Him this morning.